What if everything you thought you knew about death and judgment was only the beginning? Imagine yourself standing before an entity of pure despair, hearing its pronouncements echo through an eternal abyss. You're about to hear a powerful testimony. I'm going to share the chilling words that Javier heard from the angel of death in hell, words that reveal the true cost of unforgiveness and the profound urgency of a choice that will echo for eternity.
The cold in Valparaíso is a living thing. It is not the clean, sharp cold of the high Andes that bites your skin and leaves you numb in seconds. This cold is different. It is heavy, wet, and relentless. It crawls up from the black water of the Pacific Ocean, carrying the smell of salt, rotting kelp, and the diesel fumes of 1,000 ships. It soaks into your clothes within minutes, turning your wool sweater into a damp, freezing weight against your chest. It finds the gaps in your boots and the seams of your jacket, settling into your joints until your knees ache with a dull, throbbing rhythm that tells you exactly how old you are. I knew this cold better than I knew the faces of my own grandchildren. For 15 years I had walked through it every single night, a ghost patrolling a graveyard of steel boxes. My name is Javier Morales, and I was a practical man. I worked the graveyard shift at the Terminal Pacifico Sur, the massive container port that serves as the beating heart of our city. To most people, the port is just a noisy backdrop to their lives, a place of cranes and trucks that they see from the hills as they drink their morning coffee. To me, it was a kingdom of silence and shadows. I was the senior watchman for Sector 4, a vast concrete grid where the overflow containers were stacked 5 high, waiting for customs clearance or transfer to the massive cargo ships bound for Shanghai or Rotterdam. I took pride in my job. I was not one of those lazy kids they hire nowadays, the ones who sit in the heated booth staring at their phones for 8 hours. I walked my beat. I checked every lock. I shone my flashlight into every dark corner. I believed that if a man was paid to watch, he should watch. It was a Tuesday night, or perhaps the very early hours of Wednesday. The date does not matter now, but the weather does. The Camanchaca had rolled in thick and fast that evening. That is what we call the coastal fog here in Chile. It is not like normal mist, it is a solid wall of white that erases the world. 1 minute you can see the lights of the funiculars climbing the hills of the city, and the next minute you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. The fog that night was particularly aggressive. It swallowed the sodium floodlights of the yard, turning them into dim, hazy orange bruises in the sky. It muffled the sounds of the port, turning the distant crash of containers and the beep of reversing trucks into soft, underwater noises. I was walking down row 42, my heavy Maglite flashlight heavy in my hand. The beam cut a solid cone through the mist, illuminating millions of tiny water droplets suspended in the air. My breath smoked in front of me. I adjusted the collar of my uniform jacket, pulling it tighter around my neck, but the dampness had already won. I could feel the chill in my lower back, the familiar stiffness that I always ignored. I was 54 years old, but I told myself I was still strong. I was a man who fixed his own roof. I was a man who walked 10 kilometers a shift. I did not need pity, and I certainly did not need help. My only companion on these long nights was a small, battery-operated transistor radio that I kept in the breast pocket of my jacket. It was an old device taped together with black electrical tape, but it had a good speaker. I usually listened to the news or old boleros, the music of my youth. But tonight, the reception was terrible because of the heavy atmospheric pressure. The signal drifted and cracked, fading in and out. I turned the small dial with my gloved thumb, searching for a clear voice to break the oppressive silence of the containers. I landed on a station that was surprisingly clear. It was a talk radio program, late-night broadcasting. The host was speaking in a low, serious voice, introducing a segment about Christian testimonies. I almost changed the channel immediately. I had no patience for religion. To me, religion was for people who were afraid of the dark, people who needed fairy tales to make sense of the suffering in the world. I was a realist. I believed in what I could touch: steel, concrete, money, pain. But something about the signal quality made me stop. It was the only station not drowned in static. I walked slowly, listening. The host was reading letters from listeners, stories he called impactful testimonies of life change. He spoke about drug addicts who had found freedom, about broken marriages restored. Then he shifted to a darker topic. He began talking about near-death experiences and testimonies of hell. I scoffed audibly, the sound sharp in the empty alleyway of containers. I had heard these stories before. Evangelical testimonies were always the same, I thought. Someone makes bad choices, ruins their life, gets scared, and then claims to have seen a light. I shook my head, feeling a sense of superiority. I was a decent man. I didn't drink. I didn't gamble. I provided for my family, even if my wife and I slept in separate rooms, and my daughter hadn't called me in 3 years. I paid my taxes. I followed the rules. I didn't need powerful testimonies to tell me how to live. I was doing just fine on my own. God is not looking for good people, the voice on the radio said, as if reading my mind. He is looking for open hearts. A closed heart is a tomb, even if it is a clean one. The words irritated me. I reached up to turn the volume down, but just as I did, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. I was standing at the base of a stack of refrigerated containers, the white ones that hum loudly when their generators are running. These, however, were dry cargo units, red rusted steel stacked 3 high. My flashlight beam had caught a glimmer of metal that looked wrong. I stepped closer, squinting through the swirling fog. There, about 20 feet up, between the second and third container, a twist lock mechanism was hanging loose. The twist locks are heavy iron pins that secure the corners of the containers together, locking them into a solid tower so they don't topple during an earthquake or high winds. This one had not been engaged properly. It was dangling by a thread, and the corner of the top container was shifting slightly in the wind. The gap was small, barely an inch, but to a trained eye, it was a disaster waiting to happen. If the wind picked up, that 20-ton box could slide. It could fall. Protocol dictated that I call it in. I should have unclipped the walkie-talkie from my belt and radioed the foreman. I should have waited for a maintenance crew with a cherry picker or a ladder truck. But the foreman on duty that night was a kid named Diego, a 20-year-old who I considered incompetent and lazy. If I called him, I would have to wait in the cold for an hour while he filled out forms. I would have to explain the situation 3 times. It was a waste of time. "I'll do it myself," I muttered to the fog. It was the motto of my life. I didn't need anyone. I could fix it. There was a service ladder welded to the side of the container stack, a narrow strip of iron rungs leading up into the darkness. I tested the first rung with my boot. It was slick with condensation and grease, but it held. I adjusted my tool belt, making sure my heavy wrench was secure. I clipped the flashlight to my shoulder strap so I could use both hands. I began to climb. The metal was freezing. Even through my thick work gloves, the cold leached into my fingers, making them stiff. I climbed slowly, hand over hand, my breath laboring as I ascended. The higher I went, the thicker the fog became. At 10 feet, I could still see the ground. At 20 feet, the asphalt below disappeared into a grey swirl. I felt suspended in a void, cut off from the earth. The wind was stronger up here, whipping around the corners of the steel boxes, whistling a low, mournful tune. I reached the gap between the second and third containers. I hooked my left arm through the ladder rung to secure myself and pulled the heavy wrench from my belt with my right hand. I leaned out, hanging over the drop, and inspected the lock. It was jammed, rusted shut in the open position. I grunted with effort, slamming the wrench against the mechanism. Clang, clang. The sound rang out, deadened instantly by the heavy air. "Come on," I growled, sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the freezing temperature. "Move." I was so focused on the lock, so focused on my own competence and strength, that I didn't hear the danger until it was too late. The cranes in the port are massive electric beasts. They run on rubber tires and move with a surprising, terrifying silence. Usually they have sirens and flashing lights, but the fog dampens the light and sound travels strangely in this humidity. A rubber-tired gantry crane, an RTG, was moving down the row parallel to mine. The operator high up in his cab was blind in this weather. He was relying on sensors and GPS, but he had drifted. I didn't hear the engine. I heard the vibration. The ladder I was clinging to began to shake. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then the vibration turned into a deep, resonant shudder that traveled through the steel of the container and into my bones. I stopped hammering. I looked up. Emerging from the fog directly above me was a shadow. It was immense, a dark rectangle blotting out the orange haze of the sky. It was a 40-foot container being lowered by the crane, swinging slightly on its cables. The operator was positioning a load onto the stack behind me, but the wind had pushed the suspended load sideways. It was drifting directly toward the stack I was climbing. "Hey!" I shouted, but my voice was nothing against the wind and the hum of the crane's motors. "Stop! I'm here!" I scrambled to unhook my arm. I tried to slide down the ladder, but my boot slipped on the greasy rung. I slammed my shin against the iron, a bolt of white-hot pain shooting up my leg. I gasped, clinging to the ladder to keep from falling backward. I looked up one last time. The suspended container was swaying. It was a blue box, scarred with rust. I saw the rivets on the bottom. I saw the massive steel casting of the corner post. It was coming in slow, like a ship docking, but with the momentum of 50,000 pounds. It didn't hit me directly. If it had, I would have simply vanished. Instead, the swinging load collided with the top of the container I was attached to. The sound was not an explosion. It was a crunch, a sickening, grinding noise of metal tearing metal. The impact sheared the bolts holding my ladder to the wall. The steel beneath my hands buckled. The entire ladder peeled away from the container like a strip of tape being ripped off a box. For a second, I was weightless. I remember thinking it was peaceful. The struggle with the lock was over. The cold was gone. I was just floating in the white mist, turning slowly in the air. I saw the flashlight beam spinning wildly, illuminating the fog in strobes. I saw the ground coming up, not fast, but with a terrible, inevitable certainty. I didn't think of God. I didn't pray. I thought about the sandwich I had left in the guard booth, ham and cheese. I thought about how I wouldn't get to eat it. It was such a stupid, small thought to end a life with. I hit the concrete. I landed on my back. The impact was absolute. It felt like the earth had punched me. The air was driven from my body in a single agonizing whoosh. I heard the snap of bone, my ribs, my pelvis, perhaps my spine. It sounded like dry branches breaking in a fire. Then the second impact. The ladder, heavy steel and iron, came down on top of me. It smashed across my chest, pinning me to the wet asphalt. I lay there staring up into the fog. The pain had not started yet. My body was in shock, flooded with adrenaline. I tried to inhale, but my chest would not expand. My lungs were collapsed. I opened my mouth to scream, to call for Diego, to call for anyone, but only a wet gurgle of blood came out. The pain arrived a second later. It was a tidal wave. It started in my hips and roared up my spine, a blinding, searing heat that consumed my entire universe. It was too much for my brain to process. My vision began to tunnel. The orange lights of the port faded to grey, then to black. I could feel the cold of the ground seeping into my head. I could feel the wet dampness of the fog on my face. So, this is it, I thought. This is how Javier Morales finishes. No fanfare, no goodbye. Just a wet smear on the concrete of Sector 4. The radio in my pocket was still playing. It must have survived the fall. Faintly, through the ringing in my ears, I heard the preacher's voice one last time. "It is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment." I wanted to laugh at the irony, but I couldn't. The darkness was closing in. It wasn't like falling asleep. It was like being pulled. Something was grabbing my ankles, pulling me down through the asphalt, down through the earth. The blackness wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was waiting. My heart gave one last frantic flutter, like a bird trapped in a cage, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the port had ever been. I expected the transition to be instantaneous, a sudden cut from black to light, or perhaps the chaotic noise of an emergency room, voices shouting orders, the rip of Velcro blood pressure cuffs, the high-pitched whine of monitors. I was ready for pain. I was ready to wake up in traction, my body cast in plaster, facing months of rehabilitation and insurance paperwork. I was a man who understood consequences. If you fall, you break. If you break, you heal. That was the logic of the world I lived in. But I did not wake up in a hospital. I woke up because of the taste in my mouth. It was dry, bitter, and coated the back of my throat like pulverized chalk mixed with copper coins. I tried to cough, to hack the sensation away, but my throat was parched, devoid of moisture. I pushed myself up. My hands sank into the surface beneath me. It gave way softly, powdery and loose. I looked down. I was not lying on a gurney or a bed. I was lying on a beach, but it was not the beaches I knew. It was not the golden sand of Reñaca or the rocky shores of Concon, where I used to fish on weekends. This sand was grey. It was a monotonous, lifeless colour, like the ash left behind after a forest fire has consumed everything green and living. It was fine, incredibly fine, almost like flour. As I pulled my hand away, the dust clung to my skin, settling into the pores and the lines of my palms, turning my flesh the same dead colour as the ground. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my chest, not like a flame, but like a rising tide of ice water. I patted my body frantically, my chest, my legs, my ribs. I was wearing my blue security uniform, the same one I had put on hours ago. My heavy work boots were on my feet. My utility belt was still clipped around my waist. I ran my hands over my ribs. There was no pain, no shattered bones, no bruising. The crushing impact that should have turned my torso into pulp had left no mark. "Hello?" I shouted. My voice sounded wrong. In the open air of the port, a shout carries, bouncing off the metal containers. Here the sound simply fell out of my mouth and died. It didn't travel. It was absorbed instantly by the heavy, stagnant air. It was the acoustic equivalent of shouting into a pillow. I looked up, expecting to see the fog or the stars. The sky was gone. There was no atmosphere, no clouds, no sun, no moon. Instead, hanging perhaps 50 or 60 feet above my head, was a solid ceiling of rock. It stretched out in every direction as far as I could see, a massive, seamless slab of slate-grey stone that pressed down on the world. It was claustrophobic, terrifyingly heavy. It felt as if I was standing inside a colossal tomb, or perhaps inside a box that had been buried deep underground. The light did not come from a source I could identify. There were no bulbs, no fire. The air itself seemed to glow with a flat, shadowless luminescence, a twilight that was bright enough to see by but dim enough to hide the details of the distance. It was the color of a migraine. I spun around, trying to get my bearings. Behind me, the grey beach stretched out endlessly, rising into low dunes of that same ashen powder. In front of me lay the ocean. But it was not water. I took a step closer, my boots crunching softly in the ash. The liquid that lapped against the shore was black, pitch black. It was thick and viscous, moving with a sluggish, heavy rhythm. It didn't crash or foam. It slithered. It looked like oil mixed with coagulated blood, or perhaps raw sewage that had been allowed to rot for 1,000 years. It moved as if it were alive, heavy coils of sludge rolling over each other, licking the grey sand with a wet, sucking sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. The smell hitting me off that water was an assault. It was the stench of sulphur, of rotting meat, of stagnant drains, and something else, something chemical and sharp, like formaldehyde. It made my stomach turn over, a violent nausea that doubled me over. I retched, dry heaving, into the ash, but nothing came up. My stomach was empty, yet I felt a hunger that was absolute. It wasn't just an appetite. It was a hollowing out, a gnawing void in the center of my being that felt like it was eating me from the inside out. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, leaving a smear of grey dust on my lips. "Where am I?" I whispered. "Think, Javier, think." I was a practical man. I didn't believe in magic. I tried to force my brain to work through the logic I had relied on for 54 years. Hypothesis 1. I am in a coma. The doctors say the brain creates scenarios to deal with trauma. Maybe this is my mind trying to process the anesthesia. Hypothesis 2. I have been kidnapped. Maybe I survived the fall and someone dragged me here. But where was here? There are no caves this big in Chile. There is no ocean of oil. I looked at my wrist. My watch, a sturdy digital Casio that I had worn for a decade, was still strapped there. I pressed the button to light up the display. The screen was blank, not just off. It was dead. The numbers were gone. The liquid crystal display was just a grey rectangle. I shook his wrist. I tapped the face of the watch hard. Nothing. It was a small thing, but it terrified me more than the black ocean. A watch is a machine. Machines work. If the machine doesn't work, the rules are broken. And if the rules are broken, then I am not in the world I know. I decided I needed to move. I couldn't stay near that foul black water. I turned my back to the sea and looked toward the dunes. Just walk, I told myself. Find a road, find a wall, find a person. I took a step. It felt as if someone had sewn lead weights into the lining of my pants. The gravity here was wrong. It was heavier, denser. Every movement required a deliberate, exhausting effort. Lifting my foot felt like lifting a cinder block. My arms hung at my sides, dragging my shoulders down. It wasn't just physical weight. It was a spiritual heaviness. The air felt thick, resisting my movement, pressing against my chest like a physical hand. I wasn't just walking, I was wading through an invisible current. I trudged toward the dunes, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air was dry and stale, tasting of old dust. It didn't satisfy my lungs. No matter how deep I inhaled, I felt like I was suffocating. It was the air of a room that has been sealed shut for a century. I reached the top of the first dune, my thighs burning with the effort. I looked out, hoping to see the lights of Valparaíso, or a highway, or even a fence. I saw nothing but more grey. Miles and miles of ash dunes stretched out under that oppressive stone ceiling. It was a wasteland, a desert of dust. There was no vegetation, not a single blade of grass, not a dried bush, not a twisted tree root. It was a landscape of absolute sterility. Nothing grew here. Nothing could grow here. It was a place where life had been meticulously erased, and the silence. I stopped moving to listen. In the desert on earth there is wind. There are insects. There is the shifting of sand. Here, there was zero sound. The silence was aggressive. It was a vacuum that sucked at my ears, creating a high-pitched ringing in my head. I could hear the blood rushing in my own veins. I could hear the friction of my joints moving. It was the silence of a grave, magnified 1,000 times. "Is anyone there?" I screamed. I put everything I had into that shout. I wanted to break the silence, to shatter it. "Help me, I am Javier Morales. I work at the terminal. Someone answer me." My voice died instantly. No echo, no reply. Just the flat, grey stillness staring back at me. I fell to my knees, the ash puffing up around my legs. The denial began to crack. The practical man was running out of explanations. The fear, the real fear, began to set in. It wasn't the fear of death. I had faced death when that container fell. This was the fear of existence. The fear of being conscious in a place where consciousness shouldn't exist. I grabbed a handful of the grey sand and let it slip through my fingers. I looked at it closely in the dim light. It wasn't sand. I realized that now. It was too irregular. Some pieces were jagged, some were smooth. It looked like bone. Millions and millions of bones ground down by eternity into a fine powder. I was kneeling on a graveyard that had been pulverized into a beach. I brushed my hands off violently, a shudder running through me. I stood up, swaying under the heavy gravity. I had to keep moving. If I stopped, the weight would pin me to the ground, and I felt certain that if I lay down here, I would never get up again. The ash would swallow me. I began to walk parallel to the shoreline, keeping a distance from the black sludge but using it as a guide. I reasoned that if there was a city or a port, it would be near the water. Civilizations are built on water. Even here, in this nightmare, that logic had to hold. I walked for what felt like hours. Without my watch, without a sun to mark the passage of time, duration became meaningless. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been 2 days. I just put one heavy boot in front of the other. Crunch, drag, crunch, drag. My thirst grew unbearable. My tongue felt like a piece of dry leather in my mouth. My stomach cramped with that hollowing hunger. I thought about the thermos of coffee I had left in the guard shack. I could smell it in my memory, rich, dark, sweet. The memory was so vivid it made me weep. Tears leaked from my eyes, hot and stinging, cutting tracks through the dust on my face. "I am a good person," I whispered to the empty air. It was a mantra, a defense. "I didn't steal, I didn't kill, I mind my own business. This is a mistake, This is a clerical error. I looked out toward the black ocean again. The surface was glassy and still, reflecting the grey ceiling above like a dark mirror. Then I saw the ripples. About 50 yards out from the shore, the thick surface of the sludge was disturbed. Something was moving underneath. It wasn't a wave, it was a displacement. A hump of black liquid rose up and settled back down, like the back of a massive animal surfacing for air. I stopped. I squinted, leaning forward. "Hello?" Another ripple, closer this time. Then another. They were moving toward the shore. I took a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The instinct that keeps a gazelle alive on the savannah kicked in. Predator. A shape broke the surface. It was a head. It was sleek, coated in the oily black fluid. It was roughly the size of a human head, but it was wrong. It was too smooth, it had no hair, no ears. It turned slowly, rotating on a neck that seemed too long, too flexible. Even at this distance, I felt the gaze. There were no eyes that I could see, just smooth black hollows where eyes should be. But I knew it was looking at me. It locked onto me. I felt a cold pressure in the center of my forehead, a psychic weight that drilled into my mind. It was a gaze of absolute malice. It wasn't the hunger of an animal that wants to eat meat. It was the hunger of something that wants to consume fear. Then another head broke the surface to the left, then two more to the right. The ocean was full of them. Dozens of dark shapes were rising from the slime, silent and coordinated. They didn't make a sound. No splashing, no roaring. Just the wet, sliding noise of the oil dripping off their forms. They were the watchers. They floated there, bobbing in the filth, a silent audience waiting for the show to begin. I realized then that I was the only thing in this entire world that had color. My blue uniform, my skin, the red logo on my patch. I was a beacon. I was a bright, screaming flare in a world of grey and black. I was exposed. "No," I whimpered, backing away. "No, no, no." One of the figures in the water began to move toward the beach. It didn't swim. It seemed to glide, cutting through the sludge with terrifying speed. It was coming for the shore. It was coming for the dry land. I turned and ran. I forgot the gravity. I forgot the exhaustion. Terror is a powerful fuel. I drove my legs into the ash, pumping my arms, forcing my heavy body to sprint. My boots sank deep, trying to trip me, but I tore them free. I ran away from the ocean, away from the silent eyes, toward the endless grey dunes. I had to find somewhere to hide. I had to find a hole, a cave, a rock, anything to break the line of sight. I ran until my lungs burned like they were filled with acid. I ran until black spots danced in my vision. I crested a high dune and stumbled, rolling down the other side in a cloud of dust. I came to rest at the bottom, gasping, heaving, expecting to feel cold, wet hands grabbing my ankles. I scrambled up, ready to fight, but the creatures hadn't followed me over the dune. They were waiting. They were patient. They knew there was nowhere to go. I turned around to see where I had run to, and then I froze. Emerging from the grey gloom ahead of me were shapes, rectangular, sharp-edged shapes that didn't belong in a desert. Buildings. I rubbed my eyes, smearing the dust and tears. They were buildings, streets, roofs. I sobbed with relief. A city, civilization, people. I stumbled toward it, my legs trembling. As I got closer, the architecture became familiar. The narrow, winding streets. The way the structures were stacked on top of each other, climbing a steep hill. The corrugated metal roofs. It looked exactly like Valparaíso. But as I drew nearer, the hope died in my throat, replaced by a new, colder kind of dread. The city was colorless. The vibrant yellows, pinks, and cyans of my hometown were gone, replaced by the same leaden gray as the sky. The houses looked like they were made of cast iron and concrete, and there were no lights, no street lamps, no glow from the windows. I slowed to a walk as I entered the first street. The silence here was even heavier than on the beach. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of a trap. I looked at the nearest house. It was a small bungalow, typical of the older neighborhoods. I limped toward the door, raising my hand to knock. "Help!" I croaked. "Please open up." My fist stopped inches from the wood. There was no handle. I stared at the door. It wasn't just locked. There was no knob, no latch, no keyhole. The door was a solid slab of grey material that was fused seamlessly to the frame. I looked at the windows. Where the glass should be, there were sheets of iron, welded shut. I spun around and ran to the house across the street. No handle, no windows. I ran to the next and the next. Every single house was sealed. Every door was a wall. I was standing in a city that had been designed to keep everyone out. Or I realized with a shudder that went down to my soul, to keep everyone in. I ran down the middle of the street, my heavy boots slapping against the cobblestones. In Valparaíso, the cobblestones are usually uneven, polished by centuries of rain and tires, with weeds sprouting between the cracks. Here the street was perfect. It was a seamless, grey ribbon of stone, devoid of weeds, devoid of cracks, devoid of history. It was a street that had never been driven on, never been walked on. It was a set piece, a stage built for a play with only one actor. I reached a corner and skidded to a halt, my chest heaving against the crushing gravity. The layout was dizzying. Anyone who knows my city knows it is a maze of cerros, hills, connected by winding staircases, narrow alleyways, and hidden passages. This place mimicked that complexity, but without the chaotic charm. The buildings loomed over me, 3 and 4 stories high, leaning in slightly as if they were whispering to each other. They were stripped of all identity. There were no drying clothes hanging from lines, no flower pots on balconies, no graffiti art splashing color onto the walls. There was only grey concrete, grey iron, and grey dust. I rushed to a building that looked like a shop. In the real world, this would have been a bottileria or a bakery, a place with a bell above the door and the smell of fresh bread. I grabbed the frame of the door. My fingers clawed at the surface, looking for a seam, a hinge, a weakness. There was nothing. The door was not made of wood. It was a solid slab of the same cold metallic stone as the walls. It wasn't welded shut. It was as if the building had been carved from a single, massive block of granite. The door was just a relief carving, a cruel imitation of an entrance. I pounded on it with the heel of my hand until my skin split, and I left smears of blood on the grey surface. "Is anyone in there?" I screamed, pressing my ear against the cold stone. "I know you're in there. Open up. I have money. I can pay." I held my breath, listening. I expected to hear muffled voices, footsteps, maybe the sound of a television. I wanted to hear life. I would have given anything to hear a baby crying or a dog barking. I heard absolute, suffocating silence. It was a silence so deep it felt heavy, like water filling my ear canal. The building was solid all the way through. There was no interior. It was a monolith disguised as a home. I backed away, stumbling into the street. Panic was turning into a manic frenzy. I ran to the next building, a tall, narrow house with a balcony. I couldn't reach the door, so I looked for a rock. The street was clean, swept of all debris, but near the gutter I found a loose chunk of the grey masonry. It was heavy, dense as lead. I gripped it in both hands and hurled it at the window on the first floor. I expected the crash of glass. I expected the satisfying sound of breakage that proves you have an effect on the world. Thud. The rock bounced off the window with a dull, flat sound and fell to the ground. The window didn't crack. It didn't even scratch. It wasn't glass. It was a sheet of polished obsidian or some other dark, unbreakable mineral. It reflected my face back at me, a tiny, distorted figure in a blue uniform waving his arms in a ghost town. "Why?" I shouted at the sky. "Why build a city you can't enter?" I continued to climb. I had to get higher. In Valparaíso, safety is always uphill. If there is a tsunami, you go up. If there is a fire, you go up. I found a staircase, one of those steep, treacherous flights of concrete steps that cut between the hills. I began to ascend. The gravity fought me every inch of the way. My quadriceps burned with a fire that would have crippled me on Earth. But here, my body seemed to have an endless capacity for suffering. I couldn't catch my breath, but I couldn't pass out either. I was trapped in a state of peak physical exertion that never resolved into rest. I counted the steps. 100, 200, 300. At the top of the stairs, I found myself on a promenade, a mirador that should have offered a sweeping view of the bay. I gripped the railing, cold grey iron, and looked out. The view broke me. Below me, the city stretched out in an endless grey-scale labyrinth. Thousands of roofs, thousands of streets, thousands of sealed houses. It wasn't just a neighborhood, it went on forever, fading into the murky twilight of the horizon. And in all that vast urban sprawl, there was not a single movement. No cars, no smoke from chimneys, no birds wheeling in the sky. Just the static, frozen geometry of a dead civilization. And beyond the city, the black ocean pulsed slowly, the only thing that moved, its oily surface shimmering under the stone sky. I sank to the ground, leaning my back against the railing. The isolation hit me then, not as a sharp shock, but as a crushing weight. I was the only thinking, breathing thing in a universe of stone. I closed my eyes, trying to escape the visual monotony, but closing my eyes only amplified the sound. Thump, thump. It was quiet at first. Thump, thump. I opened my eyes. What was that? Footsteps? Was someone coming? Thump, 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 thump. It was getting louder. It was a wet, rhythmic pounding. It sounded like a heavy hammer wrapped in a wet towel hitting a wooden floor. I looked around wildly. The street was empty. Then I realized the sound was coming from inside me. It was my own heart. In the absolute silence of this place, where there was no wind to rustle leaves and no hum of electricity, the sound of my own biology became a roar. I could hear the valves of my heart snapping shut. I could hear the rush of blood through my carotid artery like a rushing river. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. It was deafening. It echoed off the grey walls of the sealed houses. My own life force was mocking me. It was a metronome counting down an eternity of nothingness. I covered my ears with my hands, pressing hard, trying to muffle the sound. But you cannot hide from a sound that originates inside your own skull. "Stop it," I whispered. "Stop beating." But it didn't stop. It hammered on, relentless, terrified. As I sat there, huddled against the railing, trembling with the noise of my own existence, a memory surfaced. It rose up from the depths of my mind with crystal clarity, playing out on the screen of my closed eyelids. It was 3 years ago, a rainy Tuesday night, much like the night I died. I was at home, sitting in my armchair, watching a soccer match. The volume was up high, I had a beer in my hand, I was comfortable, I was safe. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't a polite knock, it was frantic, desperate. I knew who it was. It was my neighbor, Senora Marta. She was a widow, 70 years old, who lived in the crumbling house next door. She was always asking for things: help with a fuse, help with a heavy box, help with a leaking pipe. I called her a nuisance. I called her a drain on my time. The knocking continued. "Don Javier, please, I smell gas, please come help me check." I remembered sitting there, staring at the TV. I remembered the thought process clearly. If I get up, I miss the penalty kick. If I go over there, she will talk for an hour. Say it's probably nothing. She's just old and confused. I didn't move. I took a sip of my beer. I reached for the remote control and turned the volume up. The knocking continued for another minute, then stopped. It turned out to be nothing, just a pilot light out. But that wasn't the point. The point was that I didn't open the door. I sat in my warm, lit room while she stood in the cold rain, begging for help. I had walled myself in. I had sealed my heart. The memory shifted. I saw my daughter Eleanor. She was 22, standing on my porch with tears in her eyes. She had come to apologize for an argument we'd had about her boyfriend. She wanted to make peace. She knocked. "Papa? Are you there? Please, let's talk." I was inside. I was standing right on the other side of the door. I held my breath so she wouldn't hear me. I wanted to teach her a lesson. I wanted to punish her with silence. I wanted to show her that I didn't need her. She knocked for 10 minutes. Then she left. She never came back. I opened my eyes in the grey city. I looked at the house across the street. The door was a solid, handleless slab of stone. It looked exactly like my front door. The realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. This city wasn't a prison built by a sadistic warden. It was a mirror. I was the architect. This entire world, the cold, the silence, the isolation, the impenetrable walls, it was all a physical manifestation of my own soul. I had spent 54 years building walls to keep people out. I had spent a lifetime turning my heart into a fortress, welding the hinges shut so I wouldn't have to deal with the messiness of love or the inconvenience of compassion. I had wanted to be left alone. I had viewed other people as interruptions to my peace. God, in his terrifying justice, had given me exactly what I wanted. I was in a world where I would never be interrupted again. I was in a city where no one would ever knock on my door. I was safe from the neighbors. I was safe from my family. I was safe from the beggars and the preachers and the weeping widows. I was completely, perfectly, eternally alone. "No!" I screamed, the word tearing at my throat. "I take it back. I didn't mean it." I scrambled to my feet and ran to the railing. I shouted down at the empty streets. "I'm sorry, Marta, Elena, I'm sorry. Open the doors. Please, someone, just open a door." My voice cracked and broke. I fell against the cold iron, sobbing. But these were not the tears of a man who is sad. They were the tears of a man who realizes he has locked himself in a vault and thrown away the key. The silence returned, swallowing my sobs. Thump, 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 thump. My heart continued its lonely drumbeat. I turned away from the railing, unable to look at the endless roofs anymore. I looked toward the center of the promenade. There was a small plaza there, paved with the same grey stone. And in the middle of the plaza, something was different. The rest of the city was static, frozen. But in the center of the plaza, the air was shimmering like heat haze on a highway, though it was freezing cold. The space seemed to be bending, distorting. And there was a sound. It wasn't my heart. It wasn't the ocean. It was a dry, scratching sound, like a metal claw being dragged across parchment. Scritch, scratch, scritch. I stopped crying. I held my breath. The sound was coming from the center of the distortion. It was precise, deliberate, intelligent. I took a step toward it. The fear I felt now was different from the panic of the closed doors. This was a holy fear, a primal recognition that I was no longer alone, but that the company I was about to keep might be worse than the solitude. The shimmering air began to coalesce. Shadows gathered from the corners of the plaza, pooling together in the center, weaving themselves into a form. A shape was emerging, a desk, a chair, a figure. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The gravity seemed to double in intensity, pinning me to the spot. I could only watch as the entity manifested in my private city, an intruder in my fortress of silence. The scratching grew louder. It was the sound of a judgment being written. I stood frozen at the edge of the plaza, my boots rooted to the grey stones by a gravity that seemed to increase with every passing second. The shimmering distortion in the center of the square began to solidify, shedding its transparency like a snake shedding skin. The air grew impossibly cold, a sudden biting freeze that had nothing to do with the damp chill of the port fog. This was a dry, absolute cold, the kind of temperature that exists in the deep void between stars. It radiated from the center of the plaza in waves, causing the moisture in my breath to turn instantly into ice crystals that fell to the ground with tiny, tinkling sounds. The shape resolved itself into a scene of terrifying banality. It was not a throne of skulls or a pit of fire, it was an office. In the middle of that dead, silent city, sitting on the cobblestones, was a massive desk. It was made of iron, rusted and pitted with age, looking as if it had been salvaged from the wreck of a ship that sank 1,000 years ago. One of the legs was shorter than the others, propped up by a rough stone to keep it level. Behind the desk sat a high-backed wooden chair, its varnish peeled away, its structure groaning under the weight of the figure who occupied it. The figure was shaped like a man, but the proportions were wrong. He was immense, broad-shouldered and looming, yet he sat hunched over the desk with the posture of a weary clerk who has been working for eternity. He wore a suit that was the color of the city, a dull, dusty grey, double-breasted and frayed at the cuffs. A layer of fine ash covered his shoulders like dandruff. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretching tight over sharp cheekbones and a hairless skull that reflected the dull light of the stone sky. He did not look up. He was writing. On the desk before him lay a book. It was enormous, as wide as the desk itself, bound in a material that looked disturbingly like dried, cracked leather. The pages were yellow and brittle, curling at the edges. The figure held a pen in his right hand. Not a quill, not a ballpoint, but a long, sharp stylus made of black metal. He wrote with a frantic, jerky speed, his hand flying across the paper without pausing for thought or breath. Scritch, scratch, scritch. The sound was agonizing. In the silence of the city, the friction of the metal tip against the rough paper sounded like a knife being dragged across a bone. It grated on my teeth. It vibrated in my skull. It was the sound of irreversible record-keeping. I took a step closer, fighting the urge to run back into the maze of sealed streets. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed my intellect, that this was the authority of this place. This was the manager. This was the one who held the keys to the locked doors. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was small, trembling, stripped of all the bravado I had carried in life. "I need help. My name is Javier Morales. I think there has been a mistake." The figure did not stop writing. He didn't even flinch. The stylus continued its furious dance across the page. "I am a security guard," I continued, stepping into the radius of the freezing cold. The frost began to bloom on the fabric of my uniform jacket, stiffening the material. I fell. At the port. "I need to go back. I have a shift." The scratching stopped. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. The figure's hand froze mid-stroke. Slowly, with the creaking motion of a rusted hinge, he lifted his head. I gasped and took a step back. He had no eyes. Where his eyes should have been, there were only shallow, smooth depressions of pale skin. It was a face that had been erased, or perhaps a face that had never finished forming. Yet as he turned that blank visage toward me, I felt seen. I felt a gaze that was sharper than any X-ray, a cold, calculating scrutiny that penetrated my skin, my skull, and dissected the grey matter of my brain. He wasn't looking at my body. He was reading the barcode of my soul. He didn't open his mouth, but his voice exploded inside my head. It didn't sound like a human voice. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates, deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of warmth. "State your business." The telepathic command brought me to my knees. The power of it was physical. It forced the air from my lungs. I want to go home," I stammered, shivering violently as the cold burned my skin. "I don't belong here. I am a decent man. I am a good citizen. Ask anyone. Ask my boss. I never stole a peso. I never hurt anyone." The figure lowered his head back to the book. He flipped a page. The sound was like a sheet of plywood snapping in half. A cloud of dust puffed up from the turning page, smelling of mold and old libraries. "You have no home," the voice rumbled in my mind, "and your shift is over, permanently." "No," I insisted, panic making me reckless. "You don't understand. I am Javier Morales. Check your book. I was baptized. My grandmother took me to the cathedral in Valparaíso when I was 6 months old. I have the certificate somewhere. I'm on the list." The figure paused again. A sound escaped him, a dry, wheezing expulsion of air. It took me a moment to realize he was laughing. It was a mirthless, dusty chuckle that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Baptized water dries, Javier," the angel said. The voice was no longer bored. It was sharp, judicial. "You rely on a ritual performed by a dead woman 60 years ago? You rely on a certificate stored in a shoebox? You think ink on paper impresses the kingdom of heaven?" He tapped the open page with his black stylus. The metal tip sparked against the paper. "This is the ledger of the living, the book of life. Every soul that belongs to the Maker is written here in ink that is actually blood. It records relationship. It records recognition." He ran a long, pale finger down the column of names. The writing was in a language I did not recognize, complex, shifting symbols that seemed to writhe on the page like living insects. But as I stared, the symbols rearranged themselves, twisting into Spanish letters for my benefit. I saw names: Maria Gonzalez, Roberto Silva, Ana Ruiz. Beside each name was a date and a faint golden glow. "I am looking for Morales," the angel said. his finger moving with agonizing slowness. Me, mm, mm. He reached the bottom of the page. He flipped to the next. He scanned it. No. He flipped another. No. Look again, I screamed, crawling forward until my hands touched the freezing iron of the desk. The cold seared my palms, but I didn't pull away. I am a good person. I worked hard. I didn't drink away my money. I didn't beat my wife. I was a quiet man. I minded my own business. The angel slammed the book shut. The sound was like a thunderclap. The ground beneath the plaza shook. The impact sent a shockwave of dust rolling over my boots. The angel leaned forward, his blank face inches from mine. The smell of him was overwhelming, the smell of old archives, of damp earth, of finality. You minded your own business, he repeated, the words dripping with disdain. Yes, that is the problem, Javier. He pointed the stylus at my chest. You think hell is a prison for criminals? You think this place is reserved for murderers and thieves? You fool. The prisons of earth are for criminals. This is for the strangers. I am not a stranger, I cried. I am a man. You are a stranger to God, the angel countered, his voice rising in intensity. So I spent 54 years ensuring that you needed no one. You built a life of total independence. You locked your heart as securely as you locked those shipping containers. You saw need, and you walked past. You saw pain, and you turned up the volume on your radio. You felt the tug of the spirit, the quiet voice whispering to you in the night, and you called it annoyance. You swatted it away like a fly. He stood up. He was terrifyingly tall, unfolding like a vast grey shadow that blocked out the stone sky. You committed the greatest sin of all, Javier. Not the sin of commission. You didn't do evil things, no. You committed the sin of omission. You did nothing. You gave nothing. You loved nothing but your own comfort. You hoarded your life like a miser hoards gold, terrified that someone might ask you for a piece of it. I cowered on the stones, trying to make myself small. His words were hitting me like physical blows. They were stripping away every defense I had ever constructed. The decent man argument was crumbling to dust. Do you remember the boy? The angel asked. The scene shifted in my mind, forced upon me by the angel's will. I was back at the port. It was 2 years ago. A young man, a backpacker, had come to the gate. He looked lost, cold, hungry. He asked for water. He asked for directions to a shelter. I was in my booth. I had a heater. I had a cooler full of water bottles. I told him to leave. I told him this was a restricted area. I threatened to call the police. I watched him walk away into the darkness, shivering. I felt a twinge of guilt, but I suppressed it. Not my problem, I had told myself. I have a job to do. He was praying for help, the angel whispered. God sent him to your gate. You were the answer to his prayer. And you closed the window. The scene shifted again. My wife sitting at the kitchen table, crying softly. She wanted to talk. She was lonely. I walked past her, grabbed a beer and went to the garage to work on my wood carving. She's just emotional, I thought. I need my space. She needed her husband, the angel said. You gave her a roommate. I sobbed into the cobblestones. I didn't know, I wailed. I didn't think it mattered. I thought as long as I didn't hurt them, I was good. The absence of evil is not good, the angel roared, his voice shaking the petrified trees of the plaza. A rock does no evil. A corpse does no evil. Goodness is active. Goodness is love in motion. You were a statue, Javier, a statue of a man, hollow on the inside. He sat back down, the chair groaning under his weight. He picked up the stylus again. The ledger records those who knew the architect. You never introduced yourself. You never opened the door when he knocked. You wanted a life without interference. You wanted privacy. You have it. You are unlisted. You are a blank page. He reached for the edge of the book to open it again, to continue his endless writing of other names, dismissing me entirely. Wait, I begged. Please, I can change. Send me back. I'll do it differently. I'll open the doors. I'll help the boy. The angel paused. He turned his head slightly, as if listening to a distant sound. Then he looked back at me with those terrible, smooth sockets. You say you are a decent man, he said softly, the mockery returning. You say you deserve to be in the book. You still believe the lie. You still think this is a mistake." He reached into the drawer of his rusted desk. The metal screeched, a sound of agony. He pulled out an object. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a stamp. It was a mirror. It was an oval hand mirror, framed in tarnished silver that was black with age. The glass was not clear. It was dark, swirling with grey smoke like the surface of the black ocean. "You cannot see yourself, Javier," the angel said. "You still see the security guard in the blue uniform. You see the body. But the body is rotting on a slab in the morgue right now. What stands before me is the soul." He held the mirror up, facing me. "Look at the witness," he commanded. "Look at what you built with 54 years of selfishness. Look at the true Javier Morales." I shook my head, squeezing my eyes shut. "No, I don't want to see." "Look!" The command forced my eyes open. An invisible hand grabbed my chin and pulled my face toward the glass. I tried to look away, but the reflection caught me. It pulled me in. I looked into the dark glass. I expected to see my face, my beard, my wrinkles, my tired brown eyes. I did not see a man. I saw a monster. The glass was not merely a reflective surface, but a deep, swirling vortex that seemed to pull the very essence of my being into its dark depths, forcing me to confront a reality I had spent a lifetime ignoring with rigorous, disciplined determination. It did not catch the dim light of the grey sky above us, but rather emitted a faint, sickly bioluminescence from within, a light that did not illuminate but rather exposed, stripping away the layers of self-deception I had worn like a second skin for 5 decades. I tried to pull my head back, to squeeze my eyes shut against the horror that was beginning to form in the smoke, but the angel's will was a vice made of iron, holding me in place with a paralysis that was absolute and terrifying. The mist in the mirror cleared slowly, dissolving like the fog at the port, and revealed the figure standing in the center of the frame, a figure that moved when I moved and trembled when I trembled. I looked for the familiar contours of my face, the grey stubble on my chin, the heavy brow, the uniform collar, the badge that gave me my identity, but none of those things were there because those were merely the costume of the actor who had finished his play. What stared back at me was the thing that had been living inside the costume, the true tenant of the house I called Javier Morales, and the sight of it drew a scream from my throat that sounded like tearing metal because my mind simply could not reconcile this monstrosity with the man I thought I was. The creature in the glass was a starving, emaciated wretch, a thing of skin and bone that looked as though it had been subjected to a famine that had lasted for centuries. Its skin was not the color of flesh, but of old wet parchment, grey and translucent, stretched so tight over its brittle skeleton that I could see the pulsating, withered organs beneath, beating with a frantic, desperate rhythm. It was humanoid, but deformed, twisted by a lifetime of malnutrition, for I realized with a sickening jolt that while I had fed my body with bread and meat, I had starved my spirit into a state of near-death atrophy. The creature's arms were long and spindly, like the legs of a spider, but where hands should have been, hands to give, hands to help, hands to lift, there were only smooth, scarred stumps, sealed over with thick, calloused tissue. I stared at those stumps in horror, and the angel's voice resonated in my skull, explaining with surgical cruelty that because I had never extended my hands in charity, because I had kept them shoved deep in my pockets to protect my own warmth, the spiritual limbs had simply rotted away from disuse. I had not used them, so I had lost them. The realization hit me that every time I walked past a beggar, every time I refused to help a neighbor move a piece of furniture, every time I kept my resources to myself, I was physically amputating my own soul, hacking away at my divine anatomy until I was left with these useless club-like appendages that could hold nothing, not even grace. But the starvation was not the worst part of the image, for as I looked closer at the trembling torso of the creature, I saw that it was wrapped in heavy, rusted chains that were not external bindings, but seemed to grow out of the skin itself, piercing the flesh with jagged metal hooks that wept a black, oily fluid. These chains were wound tight around the creature's chest, constricting its breathing, compressing the rib cage until it looked like a crushed bird cage, preventing the heart from fully expanding. I recognized the metal of those chains not by its texture, but by its feeling. It was the cold, heavy iron of unforgiveness. I saw a specific link, thick and corroded, that dug deep into the creature's shoulder, and a memory flashed before my eyes of a fight I had with my brother 20 years ago over a small inheritance, a grudge I had nursed and protected and refused to let go of until the day he died. That grudge was not a memory, it was a physical thing in this realm, a heavy shackle that I had forged link by link, day by day, carrying it around like a prized possession until it had become a part of my body. The angel whispered that I had thought my anger gave me power, that my silence gave me control, but in reality, I was simply a prisoner constructing his own cell, binding myself so tightly that I could no longer stand upright. The creature was hunched over, permanently bowed under the weight of petty slights and remembered insults. A Quasimodo of bitterness who had traded the freedom of forgiveness for the heavy, crushing armor of being right. As I continued to stare, mesmerized by the grotesque map of my own life, I noticed that the creature's mouth was not a mouth at all, but a fused scar, a jagged line of skin where the lips should have been, sewn shut with thick copper wire that was green with oxidation. I tried to scream again in the real world, but the reflection just stared back with that silenced, mutilated face, and I understood without the angel needing to speak that this was the result of my silence. I was the man who didn't speak up. I was the man who didn't testify. I was the man who never offered a word of encouragement, never prayed aloud, never used his voice to bless or to defend the weak, because I didn't want to get involved. I had treated my voice as a finite resource to be hoarded, speaking only when necessary for transaction or complaint, and so the capacity to speak life had been taken from me. The wires through the lips were the times I stayed quiet when I should have defended the truth. The scar tissue was the years of refusing to sing, refusing to praise, refusing to acknowledge the Creator who gave me breath. I was a mute soul, incapable of joining the chorus of heaven, because I had never learned the song on earth. I had valued quietness as a virtue, confusing peace with silence. But now I saw that my silence was a deformity, a deliberate crippling of the instrument God had designed for worship. The angel shifted the mirror slightly, forcing me to look at the creature's back, and there I saw the most repulsive disfigurement of all, massive weeping sores and hard calcified scales that covered the spine and the shoulders like the hide of a rhinoceros. These were not injuries inflicted by others. They were growths, tumors of pride that had hardened over decades of self-reliance. I had prided myself on needing no one, on being the decent man who stood alone, and that pride had calcified into a spiritual leprosy that made me untouchable. The scales were thick and grey, impervious to feeling, shielding the creature from any warmth or touch, isolating it completely. I realized that these scales were my goodness, my decency, my record of employment. They were the defenses I had built to tell the world I was fine, that I was sufficient, that I was better than the addicts and the thieves. But in the true light of eternity, my self-righteousness looked like a disease. It was ugly, crusty, and dead. It repelled the light. It made me incompatible with the atmosphere of heaven, which is an atmosphere of vulnerability and connection. I saw clearly that I could not enter the presence of God looking like this. The light would not just reveal me, it would incinerate me. The scales would burn, the chains would melt into my flesh, and the starvation would turn into an eternal famine. I wasn't being sent to hell because God hated me. I was being sent there because it was the only environment where a creature like this could survive. I was a creature of the dark, shaped by the dark, and adapted for the dark. The horror of this realization was physical, a nausea that started in my spirit and racked my body on the cobblestones. I looked at the angel, begging with my eyes for him to take the mirror away, to smash it, to tell me it was a trick, a hologram, a nightmare. But the angel held it steady, his hand as immovable as the mountains, forcing me to study every scar, every chain, every starvation mark. He wanted me to know the defendant before he passed the sentence. He wanted me to understand that the verdict was not based on a list of rules I had broken, but on the structural integrity of the soul I had built. I had built a hovel of selfishness and called it a palace of privacy. I had built a monster and called it a man. The reflection began to weep, black tears leaking from the hollow sockets where eyes should have been, but even the tears were thick and sludge-like, polluted by the toxic waste of a life lived for self. I saw the creature open its sewn-shut mouth, tearing the skin, trying to gasp for air, but it breathed in only dust. "This is the witness," the angel said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like the hiss of sand sliding down a dune. "This is Javier Morales, not the mask you wore for the neighbors, not the uniform you wore for the port authority. This starving, bound, silenced, diseased thing, this is what you carry into eternity. Tell me, Javier, does this look like a citizen of heaven to you? Does this look like a child of the light? Or does it look like something that belongs in the basement, in the dark, in the cold, where it can rot in peace without disturbing the saints?" The question hung in the freezing air, unanswerable and devastating. I collapsed forward, my forehead touching the cold iron of the desk, weeping uncontrollably, no longer for fear of pain, but for the sheer, overwhelming grief of what I had done to myself. I had ruined the masterpiece God intended. I had taken a blank canvas and painted it black. I had taken a living garden and turned it into a graveyard. The mirror didn't lie. The mirror was the only friend I had ever had because it was the only thing that told me the truth. I was not a good man, I was a wretch, I was a ruin, and I knew with a despair that eclipsed all hope that I was about to be discarded. The angel of the ledger did not offer a closing argument or a final sermon. He simply lowered the mirror, breaking the terrible connection between my eyes and the monstrosity I had become, and opened the rusted drawer of his desk with a screech of metal that sounded like a train, braking on a curved track. He placed the mirror inside with the casual indifference of a butcher putting away a knife after the shift is over, and then he shoved the drawer shut. The sound of it closing was a dull, flat thud that resonated through the soles of my boots and settled in the pit of my stomach. It was the sound of a coffin lid dropping into place. It was the sound of a vault door spinning its tumblers. It was the most final sound I had ever heard in my life, eclipsing the crash of the container that had killed me. He picked up his black stylus again, dipped it into a dry inkwell that somehow replenished itself with shadow, and turned his attention back to the massive book. He did not look at me. He did not acknowledge my weeping, or the snot dripping from my nose onto the cobblestones. I had been processed. I had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. I was no longer a subject of inquiry. I was waste matter to be discarded. "The audit is complete," the angel said, his voice returning to that bored tectonic rumble. He didn't even lift his head. "You are unlisted. You are unknown. You have no currency in this kingdom. You have no advocate. You have no standing." He waved his left hand toward the dark, twisting streets of the grey city behind me, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a physical blow. "Go to your place, Javier Morales. You built it. It is ready for you." I stayed on my knees, paralyzed by a terror that was absolute. "My place?" I whispered, my voice thick with phlegm and dust. "You mean the empty houses, the sealed doors?" The angel continued writing, the scratching sound filling the air. "You wanted a world without interruption," he said. "You wanted a world where no one asks you for anything. You wanted to be the master of your own domain, independent and solitary. God has granted your wish. You will wander these streets forever. No one will ever knock on your door again. No one will ever call your name. No one will ever bother you. You are finally perfectly safe from love." He paused for a fraction of a second, the stylus hovering over the page. "And when the silence becomes too loud," he added, a cruel dryness in his tone, "the watchers in the ocean will come to visit. They enjoy the company of hollow men. They will feast on the emptiness you cultivated." He turned the page. Snap. I crawled backward, away from the desk, away from the freezing cold of his presence, but the alternative was the suffocating grey heat of the city. I looked at the streets. I saw them for what they were now, not a city, but a labyrinth of my own ego. Every sealed door was a rejected friendship. Every windowless wall was a moment I had chosen comfort over compassion. I was not being sent to a fiery pit to be poked by pitchforks. That would have been too simple, too cartoonish. I was being sent to live inside my own selfishness. I was being sentenced to an eternity of me. I collapsed into the ash at the edge of the plaza. The gravity seemed to increase, pressing me down until my face was buried in the dirt. I tasted the grit of the underworld. I felt the utter hopelessness of a man who realizes that the game is not just over, but that he lost it 60 years ago and didn't realize it until now. I lay there, waiting for the watchers. I could hear them now, slithering up the street from the ocean, their wet bodies dragging against the stone. They were coming to claim the trash. But as I lay there, waiting for the end of the end, a sound echoed in the back of my mind. It wasn't a sound from this world. It was a memory. It was the static of the radio. I heard the voice of the preacher I had mocked in the fog. I heard the specific words he had spoken just minutes before the crane cable snapped. At the time I had laughed. I had called it a fairy tale for weak people. But now, in the absolute silence of hell, those words rang out with the clarity of a trumpet blast. Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. I shook my head, grinding my cheek into the stones. No, I thought. It's too late. The book is closed. The angel said I am unlisted. I am a monster. I saw the mirror. I have no hands to reach up. I have no lips to speak. I am sewn shut. Whosoever, the memory repeated, not whosoever is good, not whosoever is perfect, whosoever calls. I thought about my life. I thought about the pride I had worn like armor. I thought about how I had always fixed my own problems, paid my own debts, fought my own battles. I had never asked for help. Asking for help was weakness. Asking for help was admitting defeat. But I was defeated. I was broken. I was a stain on the pavement of eternity. I realized then that this was the one thing I had never done. I had never surrendered. I had never admitted that I was small and that God was big. I had treated God like a distant supervisor I hoped to avoid, not a father I needed to run to. I tried to push myself up, but my arms, those spiritual stumps I had seen in the mirror, had no strength. I was pinned by my own sin. I couldn't stand. I couldn't kneel. I could only lie in the dust like a worm. But I could speak. I focused all my remaining will, all the energy left in my shattered consciousness, on my throat. I felt the resistance. I felt the phantom wires that had sewn the lips of my soul shut, the wires of pride, of stubbornness, of silence. I knew that to speak this name I would have to tear those wires out. I would have to rip myself open. I would have to destroy the dignity of Javier Morales completely. I took a breath of the stale, dead air. "I am not a good man," I screamed into the stones. The angel stopped writing. The scratching ceased. "I am a wretch," I shouted, the tears flowing freely now, turning the dust on my face to mud. "I am selfish. I am empty. I built this city. I deserve this." It was the first honest confession I had made in 50 years. The confession weakened the gravity. I felt a tiny fraction of the weight lift. The truth was cutting the chains. "I have nothing to pay you with," I yelled, my voice cracking, bleeding raw emotion. "I have no good deeds. I have no money. I have nothing but this monster inside me." I looked up. The angel was watching me now. He wasn't writing. He was waiting. He looked tense, like a man watching a bomb about to detonate. I closed my eyes. I pictured the face of the man on the cross, the image I had seen in paintings and ignored 1,000 times. I didn't see a religious icon. I saw a rescue line thrown into a stormy sea. I saw the only hand in the universe that could reach into a sealed city and unlock the doors. I gathered every ounce of pain, every regret, every fear, and I forced it into a single word. I didn't whisper it. I didn't say it politely. I screamed it. "Jesus!" The name left my lips not as a word but as a shockwave. It tore through the silence of the grey world like a physical force. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The angel of the ledger was thrown back in his chair, as if he had been struck by a cannonball. The massive iron desk shuddered and groaned, sliding inches across the cobblestones. The book of life slammed shut on its own, sending a plume of dust into the air. The sky broke. It didn't crack like ice, it tore like a curtain. Directly above the plaza, the heavy slate-grey ceiling of stone split open with a sound that was louder than the loudest thunder I had ever heard. It was the sound of reality being rewritten. Through the tear in the sky, a beam of light shot down. It was not the white light of the sun. It was gold. It was living. Liquid gold, thicker than water, brighter than magnesium burning. It roared down into the plaza, a pillar of fire and glory that connected the heavens to the pit. The light hit me. I expected to be vaporized. I expected the monster I had seen in the mirror to be incinerated instantly. The light was hot, hotter than a blast furnace, but it didn't burn. It melted. I felt the heat crash over my back. I felt the scales of pride, those hard grey scabs that covered my spine, begin to hiss and dissolve. I felt the metal chains wrapped around my chest turn red-hot, then white-hot, and then liquefy, dripping off me like wax. The wires sewing my lips shut snapped and vanished. I screamed again, not in pain, but in the agony of being thawed. I had been frozen for 50 years, and now the blood was rushing back. The light invaded my pores. It rushed into the empty, starving hollows of my soul and filled them with a substance that felt like bread, like wine, like breath. The grey city around me began to shake. The walls of the sealed houses cracked. The doors I had built to keep people out were blown off their hinges by the pressure of the glory descending from above. The watchers in the ocean shrieked a high, terrible sound and dove back into the black depths, fleeing from the purity of the invasion. The angel of the ledger had fallen from his chair. He was on his knees now, his face pressed to the stones, shielding his head with his arms. He could not look at the light. He trembled, not with fear of me, but with reverence for the name I had invoked. I lay in the center of the pillar of fire, weeping, laughing, shaking. I was being unmade and remade in the span of a second. I felt the stumps of my hands tingling, growing, forming fingers that could hold, that could give. I felt my heart expanding, breaking the ribcage of selfishness, beating with a new, powerful rhythm that wasn't just for survival but for life. I heard a voice. It was not the angel's voice. It did not come from the earth. It came from the light. It was a voice like the sound of many waters, thunderous yet tender, a voice that knew my name before the foundations of the world were laid. Javier. It wasn't a question. It was a claim. The light intensified until there was nothing else. The grey beach, the black ocean, the stone sky. It was all washed away in the torrent of gold. I was falling upward, pulled by a gravity of love that was stronger than the gravity of the grave. The transition from the golden light back to the world of men was not a gentle awakening. It was a collision. It felt like falling from a 10-story building and hitting the pavement all over again, but this time the pavement was made of nerves and raw flesh. The golden light didn't fade. It slammed me into a cage of bone and muscle. The first sensation was not sight or sound, but pain. Absolute, white-hot, screaming pain. It roared through my chest like a freight train. It shattered the peace of the void. It felt as if someone were driving red-hot railroad spikes into my ribs and twisting them. My pelvis felt like it was being ground in a mortar and pestle. My lungs, which had been breathing the divine air of the light, suddenly tried to expand against a wall of fluid and crushed bone. I gasped. It was a wet, ragged sound, a desperate suck of air that sounded like a drain unclogging. It hurt so much I wanted to die again immediately. Then came the noise. The silence of the grey city was gone, replaced by a chaotic symphony of the living. I heard the high-pitched, frantic beeping of alarms. I heard the tearing of Velcro. I heard rubber soles squeaking on linoleum. I heard voices shouting in Spanish, urgent and panicked. "He's back! Get the crash cart out! We have a rhythm! BP is spiking! Get a line in, now! Hold him down! He's thrashing!" I opened my eyes. The light was blinding, but it wasn't the gold of glory. It was the harsh, sterile fluorescent white of a trauma room. I saw blurry faces hovering over me, masks, plastic shields, eyes wide with shock. I smelled antiseptic, iodine, and the metallic tang of my own blood. I tried to speak. I wanted to say the name. I wanted to tell them about the angel. I wanted to tell them about the sealed doors. But all that came out of my mouth was a groan that bubbled up through the blood in my throat. "Easy, Señor Morales, easy!" a voice shouted. A hand pressed firmly on my shoulder. "You are at the Van Buren Hospital. You have been in an accident. Do not move." I didn't need them to tell me not to move. My body was a ruin. I later learned that I had shattered my pelvis in 3 places, broken 6 ribs, punctured both lungs and fractured my L4 vertebrae. I had been clinically dead for nearly 8 minutes. The paramedics who scraped me off the asphalt at Sector 4 had called it in as a recovery, not a rescue. They had put the sheet over my face. My heart had stopped. My brain activity had ceased. But the ledger had been reopened. The recovery was a long, dark winter of agony. I spent 3 weeks in the ICU, hovering between life and fever dreams. There were nights when the pain medication wasn't enough, when the darkness of the hospital room felt too much like the darkness of the grey city. In those moments, I would panic. I would grip the metal rails of the bed with my good hand until my knuckles turned white, terrified that if I closed my eyes, I would wake up back on the ash beach with the watchers waiting for me. But I wasn't there. I was here. I felt the pain, and I thanked God for every throb of it. Pain meant I was alive. Pain meant I had nerves. Pain meant I wasn't a statue anymore. The doctors called me a medical miracle. They brought students in to look at my charts. They shook their heads, pointing at the X-rays, talking about probability and trauma survival rates. They used words like anomaly and resilience. I listened to them, but I didn't say anything. I knew it wasn't resilience. I knew I hadn't survived because I was tough. I was a 60-year-old man who ate too much bread and didn't exercise. I survived because the architect of the universe had reached down into a sealed pit and pulled me out by the scruff of my neck. I survived because I had finally admitted I couldn't save myself. The real healing, however, wasn't the knitting of the bones. It was the breaking of the walls. About a week after I woke up, a nurse came in to shave my face. I asked her for a mirror. She hesitated, probably thinking I would be upset by the bruises and the tubes taped to my nose. "Please," I rasped. "I need to see." She handed me a small plastic mirror. I held it with trembling fingers. I took a deep breath and looked. I expected to see the monster. I expected to see the grey, starving, chain-bound wretch with the sewn-shut mouth that the angel had shown me. I saw Javier. I saw a bruised, swollen old man with fear in his eyes. But there were no chains. There were no scales on my face. My mouth was open. I started to cry. The nurse thought I was in pain and reached for the morphine drip, but I waved her away. I was crying because I had been given a clean slate. The face in the mirror was just a face. It was a house that had been cleaned out, ready for a new tenant. "Nurse," I said, my voice gravelly, "I need to make a call." "You need to rest, Javier." "No," I said, and for the first time in my life, I didn't say it with anger or stubbornness. I said it with desperation. "I need to open a door, please." She brought me the phone. I dialed the number I hadn't dialed in 3 years. My hands were shaking so hard I mistyped it twice. It rang. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. "She won't answer," the old voice in my head whispered. "She hates you. You walled her out. It's too late." "Hello?" The voice was wary, guarded. It was Elena. I tried to speak, but the lump in my throat was the size of a fist. I had to force the words past the shame. "Elena," I whispered. "It's Papa." Silence on the other end. A long, heavy silence. "Papa," she said, her voice tight. "I heard about the accident. Mom told me. I didn't think you'd want me to come." "I was wrong," I blurted out. It was the hardest sentence I had ever spoken, harder than screaming at the angel. "I was wrong, Hija, about everything, about the money, about the silence. I built a wall, Eleanor. I built a terrible wall, and I am so sorry." I heard a gasp on the other line, then the sound of weeping. "I love you," I said, the words feeling strange and new in my mouth, like a language I was relearning. "Please come. Please come see me. I don't want to be alone." She came that afternoon. When she walked into the room, I didn't see a disappointment or a nuisance. I saw a miracle. I saw a person God had placed in my life to teach me how to love, and I had treated her like an interruption. I held her hand, my real hand, warm and alive, and I didn't let go for 2 hours. It took 6 months before I could walk without a cane. It took a year before the doctors cleared me for light duty. Most men my age would have taken the disability check and retired. They would have sat on the porch, watching the ocean, drinking tea. I went back to the terminal. I didn't go back because I needed the money. I went back because that was my mission field. The port wasn't just a place where containers were stored. It was a place where men worked in the dark, men like me, hard, stubborn, lonely men who thought they were decent and didn't need God. I remember my first night back on the graveyard shift. The fog was rolling in just like the night I died. The cold was there, damp and heavy. I walked to Sector 4. I stood at the base of the stack where the ladder had been replaced. I looked at the concrete. There was a faint stain there, a discoloration in the asphalt where my blood had pooled. I felt a chill then, but it wasn't the weather. It was a specific biting cold that started in my marrow. It was the memory of the angel's desk. It was the freeze of the grey city. That cold has never fully left me. It stays with me, a permanent reminder. Whenever I start to get arrogant, whenever I start to think I'm better than someone else, whenever I feel the urge to ignore a beggar or close my heart to my wife, that cold flares up. It is a mercy. It is a thorn in my flesh that keeps me awake. I walked back to the guard booth. Diego, the young foreman I used to despise, was there. He was drinking coffee, looking at his phone. "Hey, Javier," he said, not looking up. "Good to have you back. Quiet night, huh?" I looked at him. I saw the tiredness in his eyes. I saw the way he slumped in his chair. I saw a young man who was already building his own walls, already learning to be numb to the world. "Diego," I said. He looked up, surprised by the tone of my voice. "Yeah?" "Put the phone down for a second. I need to tell you something." He frowned, but he put the phone down. "What is it? Did I mess up the paperwork again?" "No," I said. I sat down opposite him. I didn't preach. I didn't shout. I just looked him in the eye with the intensity of a man who has seen the ledger. "Diego, do you think you're a good man?" He laughed, nervous. "I guess. I haven't killed anybody today. Why?" "I thought I was a good man too," I said softly. "I thought paying my bills and minding my own business was enough. I thought I could just coast through life, keeping to myself, and that God would leave me alone." I leaned forward. "I was wrong, Diego. The distance between that container and the concrete was less than 2 seconds. That's all the time I had. 2 seconds to realize that my entire life was a hollow shell." I told him. I told him everything. I told him about the grey beach. I told him about the sealed doors. I told him about the angel who didn't care about my excuses. I told him about the mirror. Diego didn't laugh. He didn't look at his phone. He sat there, pale, his coffee getting cold in his hand. "God isn't looking for decent men," I told him, my voice trembling with the urgency of the message. "He's looking for open men. He's looking for men who know they are broken. Don't wait until the weight falls on you, son. Don't wait until the book is closed." Diego didn't convert that night, but he asked questions, and the next night he asked more. And a week later, I saw him help a truck driver fix a flat tire in the rain, something the old Diego would never have done. He caught my eye across the yard and nodded. A door had cracked open. "That is my job now. I am still a watchman, but I am not watching the containers. I am watching the people. I am looking for the closed doors, the hardened hearts, the men who are building their own grey cities, and I am trying to warn them before the cement sets. If you are listening to this, I want you to look at your own life, not at your bank account, not at your clean criminal record. Look at your heart. Is it open, or is it a fortress? Do you have grudges rusting into chains around your chest? Do you have silence sewn into your lips? Don't let the devil fool you into thinking that minding your own business is a virtue. Hell is full of people who minded their own business. Heaven is full of people who surrendered their business to God. Please, I beg you, check your locks, but this time unlock them. Open the door while you still have hands to turn the knob. Open your mouth while you still have breath to speak. Call on him. Not as a backup plan, not as a desperate last resort when the darkness is already closing in, but as your only hope. The ledger is open right now. The pen is moving. The angel is writing. Make sure he knows your name. If this testimony has touched you, if you felt that cold wind on your neck, or saw a glimpse of your own reflection in my story, please don't just click away. Subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone who thinks they are good enough. You never know. You might be the one God uses to unlock a door for someone else. My name is Javier Morales. I was dead, and now I am alive. and I will spend the rest of my second shift telling the world that the light is stronger than the gray, and the blood is stronger than the ink. God bless you.